on a winter evening at New York's Waldorf Astoria, sometime in the years when Nikola Tesla was already famous but not yet ruined. The waiters knew the drill before he ever lifted a hand. Bring 18 clean napkins, not 17, not 19. Set them beside a man who would spend a full minute doing silent arithmetic over his soup, calculating its cubic volume, before he would let himself take a single spoonful. This is not folklore invented by internet numerologists. It comes from people who actually sat across the table from him. Most notably the science journalist John J. O'Neill, who knew Tesla for years and recorded these habits in his 1944 biography, Prodigal Genius. The puzzle at the center of this story is simple to state and much harder to resolve. Was Tesla's lifelong fixation on the numbers 3, 6, and 9 a genius's private glimpse into some hidden order of the universe, or the coping ritual of a brilliant, exhausted, increasingly isolated man? And how, decades after he died penniless in a Manhattan hotel room, did that private habit get inflated into one of the most viral legends in the history of science? To understand why anyone believed the first version, you have to understand what kind of reputation Tesla had already earned by the time these habits became public knowledge. By the early 1890s, he was the man behind alternating current motors and polyphase power systems that Westinghouse Electric was racing to install across America. The inventor, whose Niagara Falls power station, completed in 1895, proved that electricity could travel long distances efficiently and light entire cities. He had lectured to dazzled crowds at the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, passed hundreds of thousands of volts through his own body on stage to prove alternating current was not the deadly menace Thomas Edison's camp claimed it was, and been photographed sitting calmly amid man-made lightning in his Colorado Springs laboratory in 1899. When a man with that resume also turned out to have strange private rituals, people didn't dismiss him as merely odd. They assumed the oddness must be connected to the genius. That assumption is exactly where the myth begins to take root, and exactly where a careful historian has to slow down. Tesla's insistence on precision did not appear out of nowhere. It was, by his own account, baked into how he actually invented things. He claimed he could construct an entire machine in his mind, run it for weeks in his imagination, check it for wear and inefficiency, and only then build it, confident it would work exactly as pictured. He described the alternating current motor arriving to him almost as a vision while walking through a park in Budapest in 1882 with his friend Anthony Sigeti, reciting a line of Goethe's Faust when the design for a rotating magnetic field allegedly assembled itself in his head. Historians treat that story with some caution. It comes from Tesla's own later retelling, decades after the fact, in his 1919 autobiographical essays for Electrical Experimenter magazine, and Tesla was not an unbiased narrator of his own origin story. But the underlying claim that he worked out designs mentally with unusual completeness before committing anything to paper is corroborated by colleagues who watched him operate in real laboratories, including engineers at Westinghouse, who noted he rarely sketched preliminary drafts the way other inventors did. A mind that already trusted its own internal calculations over trial and error was primed, later in life, to trust its own internal rituals just as completely. That trust curdled over time into something much stricter and much lonelier. The dinner table habits were only the most visible layer. Contemporaries and biographers, O'Neill, later joined by the science writer Kenneth Sweezy, who befriended Tesla in his final decades and helped organize his 75th birthday celebration in 1931, described a man who walked around a city block 3 times before he would let himself enter a building, who calculated in his head compulsively while walking so that his steps landed on numbers divisible by 3, and who preferred hotel rooms whose numbers could be divided evenly by 3, moving through a string of New York hotels over the years, including the Waldorf Astoria, the St. Regis, and finally the Hotel New Yorker, always angling for a room that fit his private arithmetic. None of this comes from a clinical file. No doctor of the period diagnosed Tesla with anything resembling obsessive-compulsive disorder, a category of psychiatric classification that did not exist in its modern form during his lifetime. What we have instead are the observations of friends who loved him, some fascination, some concern, and no shortage of embellishment as they retold the stories for decades after his death. It's worth sitting with why 3 specifically, rather than some other number, seemed to matter to him so much, because the honest answer is that nobody, including Tesla, ever fully explained it. He never published a paper on numerology. He never patented an idea built around 3, 6, and 9 as cosmic constants. What he did do, repeatedly, in interviews and in his own writing, was talk about patterns, resonance, and repetition as the deep grammar of the physical world. And it is easy to see how a private counting habit and a professional obsession with harmonic frequency could get braided together in the retelling, first by fond friends, then by strangers who never met him at all. His 1900 essay for Century magazine, The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, is full of grand claims about tapping the energy of the sun, the tides, cosmic rays, none of it involving sacred numbers, all of it involving frequency, oscillation, and resonance. The actual engineering ideas he had spent years testing at Colorado Springs, where he built a laboratory specifically to study how electrical currents could travel through the Earth itself and how a resonance circuit tuned to the right frequency could in theory extract enormous power from a tiny push repeated at exactly the right rhythm. That resonance obsession was real, well documented, and genuinely important, and it is the one legitimate hinge on which the later numerology myth would eventually swing. At Colorado Springs, working with a small crew and a budget bank, rolled partly by his own dwindling funds and partly by promises to backers, Tesla built a coil capable of producing artificial lightning bolts over 100 feet long, and he kept meticulous notebooks, many of which survive and have been studied by modern engineers, tracking how small, precisely timed impulses applied again and again at a system's natural frequency could build up to enormous effects. The same principle that lets a child push a swing a little bit at a time and eventually send it soaring. He believed the Earth itself had a natural electrical resonance, and if you could find that frequency, you could transmit power wirelessly around the globe using the planet as a conductor. Modern physicists agree the Earth does have resonant frequencies in its ionospheric cavity, what we now call Schumann resonances, though they were only rigorously identified by the physicist Winfried Otto Schumann in 1952, nearly a decade after Tesla's death, and they operate at scales and with practical limitations Tesla's own calculations did not fully anticipate. He was not simply making things up. He was chasing a real phenomenon with the tools of his era and getting some of it wrong, the way scientists working at the edge of the unknown generally do. The trouble was that Tesla's confidence in his own private calculations rarely allowed room for other people's doubts, and that trait, so useful for imagining a motor complete in his head, became a serious liability once he needed sustained institutional trust rather than a single dazzling demonstration. His most consequential collaboration and rupture was with George Westinghouse, the industrialist who bought Tesla's alternating current patents in 1888 and bet his company's survival on them during the so-called War of Currents, when Thomas Edison's camp ran a public relations campaign designed to paint AC as lethally dangerous, going so far as staging public electrocutions of animals to frighten the press. Tesla, for his part, never forgave Edison for what he described as broken promises from his earlier stint working directly for Edison Machine Works in the mid-1880s. The frequently repeated story that Edison offered Tesla $50,000 to redesign Edison's DC generators and then, once the work was done, told him he simply didn't understand American humor, comes largely from Tesla's own later recollections and cannot be independently verified in Edison's own papers. But it fits a documented pattern of the two men's mutual, lasting contempt. Whatever the precise truth of that anecdote, the underlying rivalry was real, ran for decades, and it hardened something in Tesla. An unwillingness to compromise, a growing conviction that other people's skepticism was simply their failure to keep up with him. That conviction served him brilliantly right up until it didn't. When Tesla went looking for a backer to fund Wardenclyffe, his ambitious wireless transmission tower on Long Island, he turned to the financier J.P. Morgan in 1900, securing an initial investment of $150,000 on the promise of building a global wireless communication system. What Tesla did not fully disclose, and what Morgan discovered only later, was that Tesla's ambitions had quietly expanded from wireless telegraphy into wireless transmission of electrical power itself, a far more speculative and expensive proposition. When Morgan found out, and when Guglielmo Marconi succeeded in sending a wireless signal across the Atlantic in December 1901 using far simpler and cheaper technology, Morgan's confidence evaporated. He refused further funding. Tesla wrote him increasingly desperate letters over the following years, some of which survive in Morgan's papers at the Pierpont Morgan Library, pleading for more money, offering shares. insisting the tower was nearly complete and would revolutionize civilization. Morgan did not reply to most of them. Wardenclyffe stood half-finished, its huge wooden tower topped with a metal dome, a monument to a man whose private certainty had outpaced his ability to convince the people who controlled the money. And it was eventually demolished for scrap in 1917 to help pay off Tesla's debts. The financial collapse that followed reshaped Tesla's daily life in ways that made his private rituals more visible, more exaggerated in memory, and easier for later writers to mythologize. He moved from grand hotels to smaller ones as his money ran out, sometimes leaving unpaid bills behind him, a pattern documented in hotel records cited by his biographer Mark Seifer in the 1996 book Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla. He became famously attached to feeding pigeons in New York's parks, nursing injured birds back to health in his hotel rooms, an attachment he described in his own words in a 1931 conversation, later recounted by O'Neill, with more open tenderness than he showed toward almost any human relationship outside a small circle of friends that included the writer Robert Underwood Johnson and his wife Catherine, who had hosted Tesla at dinners for years and to whom he wrote warm, sometimes strikingly emotional letters. He grew increasingly fearful of germs, reportedly refusing to shake hands in his later years and developing an aversion to touching hair, round objects, and pearl jewelry, oddities that friends noted with a kind of affectionate bewilderment rather than alarm, because by then everyone who knew him simply accepted that this was who Tesla had become, a man of tremendous documented achievement, living in reduced circumstances, guarding a private set of numerical rules that made an unpredictable world feel, for a few seconds at a time, controllable. Nowhere in any of this, not in his patents, not in his published essays, not in his surviving correspondence, not in the recollections of O'Neill or Sweezy, who spent real hours with him, is there a documented instance of Tesla claiming that the numbers 3, 6, and 9 were literally the key to the universe. That specific phrase, now attached to his name across YouTube videos, memes, and self-published numerology books, appears to have no verifiable source earlier than the early 2010s, and it traces most directly not to Tesla scholarship, but to the vortex-based mathematics movement, popularized by an amateur numerologist named Marco Rodin, starting in the 1990s, who argued that the digits 9 and 6 and 3 revealed hidden patterns when you repeatedly reduced multiplication tables to their single-digit digital roots, a mathematical trick that is real and easy to demonstrate, but which is simply a consequence of how our base 10-number system behaves, not evidence of any cosmic secret. Rodin and later online communities attached Tesla's name to these ideas because Tesla's reputation as a misunderstood, suppressed genius made him the perfect patron saint for a theory that claimed mainstream science was hiding something. It is a testable claim in one narrow sense. You can search Tesla's own writings, and no serious Tesla archive, including the collections held by the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, has ever produced the original document where he supposedly said it. That gap between the documented man and the manufactured myth is where the real story about character actually lives, and it cuts in two directions at once. On one side, it would be a mistake to pretend Tesla was simply a rigorous, sober engineer whose reputation was hijacked by internet cranks with no help from him. He gave interviews throughout his life that leaned hard into mysticism, telling a reporter for the New York Times in 1932 that he had invented a thought photography device capable of capturing mental images, and describing to journalists his belief that he had once received signals from another planet during his Colorado Springs experiments in 1899, a claim serious contemporary scientists dismissed then and continue to dismiss now as almost certainly a misread of stray atmospheric radio interference or possibly signals related to Marconi's own early transmissions, though Tesla never backed down from the interpretation publicly. He courted the language of cosmic revelation himself, describing his ambitions in near-messianic terms in his own 1919 autobiographical writings, presenting himself less as a careful experimentalist and more as a solitary prophet who had glimpsed truths the rest of the world was too slow to understand. That self-presentation, cultivated across decades of interviews, gave later mythmakers exactly the raw material they needed. On the other side, the specific content of the myth, the tidy slogan about 3, 6, and 9 unlocking the universe, is not Tesla's own claim, and treating it as though it were erases the more interesting, more human, and frankly sadder story underneath it. A man whose real numerical rituals were private, repetitive, and almost certainly born of anxiety, rather than revelation, being repackaged after his death, first by well-meaning friends who wanted to keep his memory alive and paint him as a misunderstood visionary, and later by people with no direct connection to him at all who found his name useful for selling a theory he never articulated. O'Neill's 1944 biography, written by a friend who genuinely admired Tesla and wanted the world to appreciate him after the humiliations of his final years, already leans toward hagiography in places, softening contradictions and presenting eccentricities as evidence of a higher order of mind. Later popular treatments went much further, and by the time cable documentaries and online communities in the 2000s and 2010s began repeating claims about Tesla's supposed secret knowledge of universal numerical law, the distance between the documented historical person and the folk legend had become enormous, and almost nobody checking a viral quote graphic was pausing to ask for a footnote. Serious historians of technology, including Bernard Carlson, whose 2013 biography Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, remains one of the most carefully sourced accounts of his life, have tried to pull the conversation back toward what can actually be verified. A formidably talented engineer with genuine world-changing contributions to alternating current power systems, radio technology, and early wireless experimentation, who also happened to be a person with rigid private habits, financial recklessness, a taste for grandiose self-mythologizing in public interviews, and a set of personal quirks that friends found endearing and strangers later found marketable. Carlson and other scholars are careful to note that Tesla's actual scientific legacy does not need numerology to be extraordinary. His polyphase AC system remains foundational to how electricity is generated and distributed today, and his early radio patents, contested for decades in a legal battle with Marconi's company, were finally upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 1943, just months after Tesla's death, in a ruling that recognized his priority on several key elements of radio transmission, a vindication he never lived to see. He died alone on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, found by a maid who had ignored his instructions not to be disturbed because something felt wrong. Whether that room number ending in a digit divisible by 3 was chosen deliberately or was simply where a broke elderly man happened to be staying is exactly the kind of detail that the myth-hungry retelling of his life loves to seize on, and exactly the kind of detail a careful historian has to resist over-interpreting. His body was examined, his remaining possessions and papers were seized by agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Office of Alien Property, given his prior work on unrealized weapons concepts and lingering wartime anxiety about foreign nationals holding sensitive scientific ideas, and reviewed before eventually being released to his nephew and later transferred to Belgrade, where they form the core of the Nikola Tesla Museum's archive today. The man who had once commanded rooms full of engineers and financiers with demonstrations of man-made lightning ended his life mattering enough to be watched by federal agents, but not enough to be checked on by anyone who might have called a doctor sooner. What the story of the 3, 6, and 9 ultimately reveals has less to do with hidden mathematics and more to do with the mechanics of legend building itself, and how quickly a real person's genuine, verifiable eccentricity can be smoothed over, exaggerated, and finally replaced by something more marketable than the truth. Tesla really did count his steps. He really did prefer certain hotel rooms and certain multiples at the dinner table, and friends who loved him watched it happen for decades without ever writing down anything resembling a grand unified theory of the universe attributed to those habits. The theory came later, built by people chasing clicks and converts rather than footnotes, borrowing the authority of a dead genius who could no longer object. The real Tesla left behind patents, notebooks, court rulings, and the bones of the electrical grid. Much of the world still runs on. The numerological Tesla, the one who supposedly whispered the secret key to existence, was assembled after his death by admirers and strangers alike, and it says something uncomfortable about how we tell the history of science that the invented version has, for many people online today, become more famous than the real one ever was.